Good morning, afternoon or evening everybody. Welcome back to another scale model build series. I'm taking a small break from building armor and heading out into the Atlantic. This series I'm going to be building this ancient Revell kit of U99. This model I built as part of the German Army Group build 2025. There's a world of awesome builds on their Instagram channel, so check it out if you haven't done already. So this build, I wanted to build a Type 7 BU boat, in particular Otto Kretchmer's U99, and it just so happens back in the 1970s, Revell made such a kit. However, as you can see, this kit is very basic. I mean, the detail is almost non-existent. It's the shape of a U-boat, that's about it. So over the build series, I'm going to try and add some details back in, adding welds, handles, 3D printed guns, rigging, and some homemade decals. So without further ado, let's get started. The first stage is the hull assembly and stand, of which will be the main focus of this video. The plan here is to add in some weld details to the hull, as at the moment it's far too smooth for my liking. As well as additional weld details, I'll be cutting out the limber holes. First thing to do though, is to cut the two hull components off the sprue and trim down the excess using a scalpel. There's a few bits of flash about, so I ensure these are trimmed down as well before moving on to the next stage. Not going too ham on the cleanup at this stage, as there will be plenty of that to do once the two pieces are joined. Next, I build the little stand that comes with the kit. I will be making my own bespoke one later down the line, but this one will do for the building and painting stages. Now it's time to drill out all the limber holes. To do this, I find a drill bit the correct size for the circle holes, grab an old bit of foam so I don't drill 1,000 holes into my desk, and just start drilling them out. The circle ones are easy, just a case of drilling through and cleaning up the excess with a scalpel and smoothing further with some tweezers. For the oval ones, it's a case of drilling two holes next to each other and joining together with a scalpel. This takes a fair amount of carving to get them neat, trying my best to keep them as uniform as possible. Again, I use a pair of tweezers to scrape and push the plastic to make them smooth. Then it's just the small case of doing every single limber hole in the hull, drilling, cutting, smoothing, and repeat. After a while, you do get into the swing of things, and it starts to speed up, but still, it's a good 3 evenings work ahead. Once batches are complete, I go over all the holes with some extra thin cement. This helps smooth the holes even further by melting the plastic. Whilst this process takes time, I think the results will speak for themselves. Ultimately, those holes are going to need to be painted black individually anyway, and I am certain the results from cutting them will be much better than the painted-on look. With all the limber holes cut out, we can now start to attach the hull sections together and fit the deck. I start by cutting the two deck components from the sprue and clean them up with a scalpel and some sandpaper. There is a fair bit of flash on these deck parts, and there was also a load of injector pin marks all over the top surface, which was rather annoying. I carefully cut all these off and ensure the deck's nice and clean before moving on to the next stage. With the decks cleaned up, we can now move on and attach the two halves of the hull together. I start by running extra thin cement all around the connection points and quickly put the hull together. This isn't a great hold, but will help keep it in place for now. Next, I get out the quick dry cement and go over all the seams whilst holding the two halves tightly in place. This stuff is amazing if you want an instant hold, as it pretty much cures on impact. I use some tape to hold together some trickier places and go over again with the cement. Now the hull is one piece, we can fit the decking. They come with these strange tabs, which almost signifies they need to be joined prior to fitting, but they kept falling apart. In the end, I held them together and started maneuvering them into place. The fit is okay at best. It took a fair bit of jiggery-pokery to get them into position, and even then, there were gaps and high spots all over the place. Next, I go along the whole deck adding cement and taping down in place so it can properly cure. This was the only way I could get it to stay down remotely level. Once I taped the whole thing down, the hull of the U-boat is finally in one piece. I gave the glue a bit of time to cure, then removed the tape ready for cleanup. The first thing to do is clean up some of the areas and get rid of any ridiculously high spots with a scalpel. Once carved, I give it a light sand to get it as smooth as possible. Next, it's time to start filling some gaps. For this, I am using Tamiya putty. I have found this is the easiest to use and has a relatively quick drying time. I put it on fairly roughly with a cocktail stick and try to remove as much excess as possible. This process is repeated across the top deck, scraping, sanding, and roughly filling with the putty. I do a few areas at a time, simply so the first area can cure whilst I prep the next. Then it's time to sand it down and make the areas smooth. This can involve further carving to get rid of any excess putty and also rescribing in some of the detail. This is quite a long-winded process, but on a submarine, the hull is the main feature really, so we want it to be as good as possible before moving on. Some areas required more putty to fill the gap further. It's a rinse and repeat process to get all the seams as neat as possible. Once I am happy with the decking, I move on to the lower hull sections, which required a lot of trimming down and some filling in places. The aim here is to get the seam as smooth as possible, so it won't show up when we start painting. The front net cutters also needed recarving, as the two sides of the hull are not quite molded correctly to line up. I just carefully recut them with a scalpel and use some cement to smooth it down afterwards. The front didn't need any filling, which was nice, just a good sanding to get it smooth. When the sanding process is complete, we are left with a nice, smooth canvas to work on. Now it's time to add some details. I'm going to add some weld lines and some rivets to the side to add some texture to the currently super smooth hull. The first point of call is to map out the welds. I start with a pencil and draw on the weld positions. Whilst it's not super accurate, I looked at a lot of reference photos to get an idea of where weld lines would be. Once the pencil lines are drawn, I go over them with a permanent marker. This is for two reasons. First, to give me a clearer picture of where the main detail lines will be added, and also allow me to draw in the rivet details in pencil, so I can differentiate between the two. Now I have all my guidelines set, I start adding rivets using this rivet tool by Trumpeter. This was my first pop at adding rivets. It's fairly simple to use, just run the blade anywhere you want them, and like magic they appear. If you make a mistake, you can use sandpaper to sand it back smooth and go again. I know, U-boat hulls were mostly welded, not riveted, but as you can see from this picture, I took of a Type 7C U-boat there were some, and my aim here is just to add some kind of texture to the smooth hull. I run the rivets either side of the weld lines and add some additional rivets in lines acting like panel lines. This will also give me a reference when painting. It's quite crazy how little pressure you need to create these little rivets. The hardest part is seeing what you are doing, but it gets easier. With the rivets done, it's time to add some weld detail. First step is to create some extra thin strips out of an old sprue. To do this, I gently heat the sprue with a lighter until it starts to flop. Then I carefully stretch the plastic until I have strips the thickness I want. I then trim these down to a more manageable size. I create a load of these strips so I can add all the weld seams in one sitting. With all the strips made, we can start adding them to the hull of the U-boat using the quick, dry cement. I carefully start overlaying all my black lines with the weld seams, holding it in place and using the quick, dry cement to weld it to the surface. The fact this stuff cures almost instantly is vital in this process, as it means I don't have to hold in place for ages waiting for it to cure. Whilst it's pretty instant in curing, there is a small amount of time of which you can move it slightly with some tweezers just to get it straight. Then all there is to do is trim the ends, and that's it. Time to rinse and repeat on all the black lines. The curved vertical weld lines are a little more tricky, with some extra holding in place with the tweezers until it cures properly. Some parts melted too much and snapped, but these can easily be repositioned with the tweezers. It's important to remember these lines were never that straight in real life, so a slight wobble or some imperfections actually add to the overall detail rather than subtract. With the welds done, that's the detailing of the hull complete and where we are going to draw this episode to a close. If you have enjoyed this video or found it vaguely helpful, please let me know by hitting those like and subscribe buttons and let me know your thoughts in the comments. As always, thank you for watching. I look forward to seeing you next time, and as always, happy modeling everybody.